Hi everybody, welcome back to Supernatural Night Terror by John Passarella. Last time there was another nightmarish death, and we discovered that me recording earlier in the day doesn't make me any better at not stumbling over words. But, you know, we're doing this for fun, so it really doesn't matter. Okay. Chapter 7. Another sleepless night was what the grey-haired woman had come to expect. Oh my god, again, story of my life. She hardly ever slept well in her bed. Maybe an hour here, a half-hour there, tossing and turning. Aches and pains too numerous to categorise contributed to her long nights. But not all the aches were physical. Memories had a way of keeping her awake into the wee hours. Invariably, she would surrender the idea of sleeping in her bed and instead settle into her musty recliner and watch television. If she was lucky, she'd catch a few hours of sleep spread over the long night. Lately, her level of exhaustion had become more pronounced. Throughout the day, she would bumble through her inconsequential routines, and by evening she had so little energy it was a wonder she didn't collapse simply from climbing the stairs or completing a minimal amount of housework. Nothing seemed to matter much to her anymore. She wondered how long she could go on simply marking time. Living had become a reflex, a habit. She found no joy in it and hadn't for some time. She reached for the remote control, and her hand, with veins and liver spots more prominent than they'd been a week ago, trembled with the effort. Such a simple act was almost beyond her current level of physical stamina. Maybe it wasn't physical. Maybe it was a neurological issue. Health problems plagued the elderly, became the focus of their twilight years, marking time in the interval between taking one pill and the next. She turned the television on and leaned back in the recliner. Her eyelids already heavy with a sleep deficit she could never pay. It would do her good to see the doctor. Another routine to pass the time. Of course, he didn't care if she got better. Wouldn't know her name if she bumped into him on the street. But he tried to shock her with predictions of death and disease. Inevitable, but he made it entertaining. A jolt to remind her she was alive and not yet worm food. Yes, she'd pass some time with the doctor again, because, oddly enough, he was a comfort to her. He was familiar with death and violence and tragedy as she had become. Images flickered on the television set, and she was only half conscious of them. As she slipped in and out of her troubled sleep, she was unaware of another image, an expanse of darkness that slipped under her door like a trick of the light, then flowed up her wall, slid across the ceiling, and descended to the back of her chair, dyeing the ivory antimacassar on her headrest deepest black. And there it began to swell into a roiling mass of darkness, with a head and glowing red eyes rising from the centre and arms growing from the sides. Spindly, crouched legs formed beneath the torso. These were new, but improving, strengthening, as were its abilities. The darkness became as comfortable as the old woman in her recliner. The house and the chair and the woman had already become familiar to the monster. It had mined a rich vein of darkness with this one. But soon their collaborations would come to an end. It sensed time was running out. Yet all was not lost. The town presented so many intriguing possibilities, and the night was young. As twin red eyes burned in its obsidian head, it reached out with fingers of solidified darkness and draped them over her forehead. In moments, it began to feed. In keeping with his nightly routine, after grading the 8th grade science homework and preparing a lesson plan for the next school day, Harvey Dufford jogged along Welker Street, turned left on Main, past the municipal building and the factory fire memorial, and then turned left again onto Bell Street. He followed Bell past the commercial district and into the business district at the west end of Clayton Falls. Most of his jogging route kept him in view of the restaurants, nightclubs and shops with evening hours. Though the crime rate in town was generally low, he thought it prudent to remain in high pedestrian traffic areas for his daily cardio workout, and so it was always with a little trepidation that he concluded his nighttime run by crossing through the cluster of professional buildings across from his townhome community. Most of these offices closed at 5 or 6, with the exception of the scattered general practitioner or dentist who offered evening hours once or twice a week. Streetlights shone down on the modest parking lots, revealing an eerie absence of cars and people. Sometimes Dufford experienced an otherworldly vibe from the professional buildings, as if he had slipped out of the normal time stream and had lost contact with the rest of humanity. On more than one occasion he had considered planning a new route to avoid these dead spots, but ultimately he thought they provided motivation for him towards the end of his run. He was closing in on 55 years of age, and his legs lacked the spring of youth, had for some time, and that leaden leg feeling regularly overcame him towards the end of his route. Probably psychological, knowing he was almost finished, making his body crave rest. So why not counter the physical exhaustion with a burst of adrenaline derived from his anxiety when jogging through this deserted section of town? As he approached the cluster of professional buildings, the bright lights of open stores became scattered, the sounds of pedestrian activity became hushed, the rush of cars separated into the passage of individual vehicles separated by increasing intervals, as if the heartbeat of the town weakened and slowed, nearing a flat line. That was when Dufford picked up his pace, placing one foot in front of the other, faster and faster with each long stride, forcing himself into a last sprint to feel his heart rate quicken. His mouth opened and he sucked down air in great gulps to satisfy his demanding lungs. He leaned into a left turn and entered the parking lot of his first structure. To his right, the beige 1- and 2-story buildings presented dark lobbies behind plexiglass doors with official office hours posted in the form of black stencils on the glass or on freestanding message boards. To his right, beyond the parking islands, grassy mounds rose to vinyl privacy fencing. For Dufford, taking the shortcut back to his town home why is that so hard to say? Town home instilled the claustrophobic sensation of running through a long tunnel. A 2-lane entranceway adjoined the next block of offices without providing any street exit. At regular intervals, signs were posted discouraging through traffic. Pedestrians were limited to narrow grass-covered gaps between clusters of connected buildings. The layout discouraged street and foot traffic for anyone without official business or a medical appointment. In the evening, hourly patrol car sweeps deterred loitering teenagers and would-be vandals. But a lot can happen in an hour. So focused was he on maintaining his brisk pace that several moments passed before Dufford noticed the thin layer of mist that puffed and swirled around his running shoes. Because he turned his attention to the unusual phenomenon, he failed to hear the padding sound coming up swiftly behind him until it was almost too late. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up on end, and he had a premonition someone was about to jump him. Being mugged while jogging was something he often worried about, especially since he carried no wallet while exercising, relying on the emergency contact bracelet he wore in case of an accident. A mugger faced with a penniless victim was likely to react with extreme prejudice. Another reason he avoided deserted sections of town, but he couldn't have been less prepared for this attacker, not in his wildest imaginings. As he whirled around, raising a forearm for protection from a blow he was certain was imminent, he stared in horror at the monstrous shape bearing down on him. Its body was the size of a minivan, each of its 8 red-banded legs as thick as a fire hose. One part of his science teacher brain identified the giant spider as a Mexican red-kneed tarantula, while another part rationalized that it couldn't survive at that extreme size, it would be crushed under its own weight. But somehow it did exist, and it was chasing him. The most primitive part of his brain triggered his flight response. Unfortunately, he had effectively run himself to near exhaustion before the threat had materialized. His heart raced wildly, he had a stitch in his side, and his legs felt like blocks of wood fastened awkwardly to his hips. He'd never felt closer to 60 years of age before. He spun on his heels and veered to the right, narrowly avoiding a swipe by one of the creature's hairy front legs. But one of the retractable claws at the tip of the leg tore through his soaked sweatshirt and caused him to stumble. Catching his balance on the round cement base of a parking lot lamppost, he placed the vertical obstacle between himself and the enormous spider, and immediately realized his mistake. The tarantula wouldn't have to move. Its legs were long enough to reach around the pole. Lucy Quinn sat on one of the matching pair of Adirondack chairs, with her feet up on the porch railing, mirroring the relaxed posture of Tony Lacosta. The weight of the long night kept prodding her to get up and walk home. Inertia kept her seated. Tony's parents had come home from work hours ago, whipping together a mix-and-match dinner of several nights' leftovers to which they had invited her. Afterwards, they had retired to the family room to watch TV, while Tony and Lucy returned to their porch chairs, each with a can of Coke. From the look Tony gave her when he took them out of the fridge, she could tell he wished they were beers. Lucy didn't think his parents minded her hanging out here with her son, even if they would never think of her as a good influence. But they probably figured he had fewer opportunities for trouble or mischief if he stayed close to home. And after what had happened to Steve, they were a bit traumatized by the occasional randomness of fatal accidents. Of course, Tony and Lucy, along with Steve, had been complicit in the accident that had cost Teddy his life. They had somebody to blame for that, and it made sense when you factored in the carelessness of teenagers and driving under the influence. But Steve, run down by a stranger out of the blue, like a bolt of lightning that could strike down anyone, how could a parent rationalise that, or come to terms with it? Lucy took a sip of her Coke, shook the can, not much left. "So have you talked to Steve's parents?" she asked. "Earlier," Tony said. "They're messed up about it, naturally. Weird thing is, I felt like I should apologise." She turned to look at him, his face almost amber in the one street light, and he had a faraway look in his eyes. "You feel guilty," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah. Don't you?" She nodded. "They call it survivor's guilt." "Oh, it's him or us, right?" "Right." Tony tilted his Coke back, finished it off. "Maybe we should have stayed together." After a long moment, she said, "Maybe." Reluctantly, she dropped her feet to the wooden porch floor and pushed herself out of the low chair. "So, I should go. Want a lift?" "That's okay," she said. "A walk will clear my head. You going in?" "In a few minutes." "See ya," she said, taking the 3 stairs slowly, as if she'd been drinking alcohol instead of a soft drink for the last few hours. Tony waved when she glanced back from the bottom of his driveway. "Later, Luce." After a few blocks, the weight of sadness she carried whenever she was around Tony eased. It wasn't his fault. She'd felt the same sadness with Steve, though it hadn't seemed as bad when all 3 of them were together. Now Steve's absence reminded her of Teddy's absence. Not that she ever needed a reminder of that. Though they put her in a melancholy frame of mind, she craved those connections. They helped her keep Teddy in her thoughts. A fine white mist drifted across the street, undulating across the asphalt, spreading across the sidewalk like a living veil. She hugged herself against the chill night air, rubbing her arms to generate some warmth and missing Teddy's arm across her shoulders. It came as a surprise to her that she was trying to live in the past, trying to recapture those days of a year gone by, before the accident. But that past was forever lost to her. Her town, her neighbours, had that in common with her. They built a memorial to help them remember the past, but their past was fresher, only 6 months gone. Every day they placed flowers and stuffed animals at the memorial and lingered in their lost past as she lingered in hers. But few placed flowers at the site of the factory fire. The scorched brick of the crumbling building, surrounded by the teetering wrought iron fencing, was too harsh a reminder of what had been lost and how horribly it had been wrenched from them. She would have to decide how long she'd cling to her memories of living while Teddy was still a part of her life. Would a day come when she looked forward to the future more than she longed for the past? Ahead of her, a car engine raced with a throaty roar. A moment later, high beams flared, blinding her. She raised her forearm to shield her eyes. The car, a dark, boxy shape, cloaked behind its headlights, sat in the middle of the street, unmoving. She wondered how long the driver had been sitting there. Lucky somebody hadn't crashed into him already. The street wasn't busy, but cars passed at regular intervals. The engine raced again, and the car lurched forward. "Jackass," she whispered. As if the driver heard her disparaging remark, the car swerved across the street towards her, along the shoulder, and jumped the curb. As the car barreled down the sidewalk towards her, she had a horrifying thought. "He's trying to run me down!" And that is the end of chapter 7. Oh, and chapter 8 we come back to the horrible tarantula, so oof, see how that plays out. But yeah, until then, see you later.